The two men came in blindfolded, walking a farm lane southwest of Bastogne, under a bedsheet tied to a stick, and the American outposts at Kessler's Woods let them come. It was just past 11 in the morning on the 22nd of December, 1944, and Sergeant Carl Dickinson watched them approach across the snow with their hands raised, one a major, one a lieutenant who spoke passable English. The Germans expected to be received. Everything in their bearing said it. The clean greatcoats, the correct courtesy, the typed document folded inside a leather case. They had done this before at Stalingrad and Cherbourg, and a dozen smaller places, and the ritual almost always ended the same way, with a beaten garrison choosing life over annihilation. What they did not know, walking that lane, was that the men they had come to intimidate were down to a handful of rounds per gun and would not give them the answer the manual promised. If you served in the 101st or the 10th Armored or any outfit that held a frozen line that winter, tell us in the comments your unit, the ground you held, the men who stood beside you, the ones who didn't come home, and write it for a father or a grandfather who can't. Subscribe so their record doesn't vanish, and like this so it reaches the people who lived it. Because the story of that white flag is the story of an army that had learned again and again to expect a rational enemy and met one who refused to be reasonable. The German ultimatum was a serious document, written by serious men who were not fools, and it repays a careful reading. The German commander demanded the surrender of the encircled town on the threat of annihilation by massed artillery corps, and gave the Americans 2 hours to reply. It listed the encirclement in precise terms, the armored spearheads that had rolled past the town on both sides, the closing ring, the batteries being laid in. All of it was true. General Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz, commanding the 47th Panzer Corps, had a genuine problem in Bastogne, and he was trying to solve it the efficient way, the way a professional solves a problem when he holds the stronger hand. He did hold the stronger hand on paper. 7 roads met in that town, and his divisions needed those roads to reach the Meuse, and every hour they spent masking Bastogne was an hour his fuel-starved columns bled away to the west. Just as Napoleon's marshals learned that a bypass fortress astride a supply road is not bypassed at all, so too did von Luttwitz understand that the crossroads had to fall, or his whole timetable came apart. The blindfolded major carried a soldier's logic in his leather case, and by every rule of that logic, the answer coming back should have been a negotiation. The paper went up the chain to the acting division commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, in the cold cellar of the Heinz barracks that served as his command post, and here the accounts get gloriously specific about a moment that could easily have been lost. McAuliffe was roused, read the German demand, and his first reaction, recorded by the officers standing around him, was contemptuous confusion, because he had spent the morning thinking his own attacks were going well, not that anyone would be asking him to quit. He said something dismissive, a mild profanity, and dropped the paper. Then, his operations officer, Lieutenant Colonel Ned Moore, reminded him the Germans were waiting on a formal reply, and McAuliffe sat down to compose one, and could not think how to begin. It was Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard who spoke up and suggested his first remark had been about right. What McAuliffe had actually muttered was earthier, and every veteran in that cellar knew it. But the word typed onto the reply and handed to the waiting German major read simply, in full, "To the German commander, Nuts, the American commander." The major did not understand it. Neither did the interpreter, who asked whether the reply was affirmative or negative, and Colonel Joseph Harper, who walked the parlementaires back to their lines, told him plainly it meant, "Go to hell." Harper's own account of what he said next is blunt. He told the German that if his people kept attacking, the Americans would kill every goddamn German who tried to break into the town. Then he wished them a nice Christmas, which under the circumstances was suboptimal manners. Watch what the Germans did with that word. They had come expecting a yes, or at least a maybe, and they carried back one syllable of American slang that their staff could not translate and their artillery could not answer. The riddle of Bastogne begins right there, in the gap between what von Luttwitz's manual predicted and what a starving Garrison actually said. Look at a map of the Ardennes as it sat on the 16th of December, 1944, and one town keeps pulling the eye. Bastogne sits on no high ground. It guards no river and shelters no factory worth the name. What it has is roads, 7 paved routes converging on a single market town, like spokes into a hub, in a region where the winter forest turns every off-road move into a crawl and every ravine into a tank trap. General von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, understood this better than almost anyone in the German command. His whole plan depended on speed, and speed in the Ardennes meant roads, and the roads meant Bastogne. Manteuffel was not a gambler by temperament. He was a small, precise cavalryman who had studied the ground personally, crawling forward in civilian clothes to watch the American lines before the offensive, and he had told Hitler to his face that the timetable was too tight. The Meuse River lay 60 miles west. Beyond it, Antwerp, the port that would split the British from the Americans and hand the Reich a negotiated peace, or so the fantasy in the wolf's lair ran. To reach the Meuse before the Americans recovered, Manteuffel's columns had to move like water, finding the path of least resistance and never stopping. A blocked crossroads was not an inconvenience. It was the failure of the entire enterprise. One number decided everything. The Germans allotted themselves roughly 2 days to take Bastogne, and they assumed a lightly held town would fall to the first hard shove. On the 15th of December, that assumption was reasonable. The sector was a rest area, a place where green divisions and battered ones were parked to recover, thinly manned on purpose. Nobody serious expected a massed panzer thrust through terrain the textbooks called impassable. The Germans had walked this trick before, in 1940, through the same forest, against the same complacency, and it had worked spectacularly. Von Manteuffel had every reason to think lightning could strike the same ground twice. The British had tried something structurally similar 3 months earlier, and it is worth a short detour to see why it matters. At Arnhem in September, Montgomery had flung an airborne corps far ahead of his ground forces to seize a chain of bridges, betting that armor could race up a single road to relieve the paratroopers before the Germans crushed them. The bet failed because the ground column could not keep to the timetable, and the isolated airborne troops were ground down while help crawled toward them too slowly. Manteuffel now sat on the opposite side of exactly that equation. He was the armored column racing a clock, and Bastogne was the obstacle that could make his timetable slip the way the British timetable had slipped on the road to Arnhem, back to the crossroads. because the thing that broke the German schedule was not a fortress, it was a road march. When word of the breakthrough reached the rear, the 101st Airborne was pulled out of its rest camps near Reims, loaded onto open cattle trucks in the freezing dark, and hauled 100 miles north through the night of the 18th of December. Men climbed down half-frozen, many without overcoats, some without helmets, drawing ammunition from the trucks as they walked toward the sound of the guns. These were not fresh troops. They had jumped into Normandy in June and into Holland in September, and they were supposed to be refitting. Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division rolled in from the south to stiffen them. The garrison that formed around Bastogne assembled itself, unit by unit, faster than the Germans believed possible. Von Manteuffel got the speed wrong, and the speed was the whole hinge. His intelligence pictured a soft town he could take on the bounce. What actually reached the crossroads first, by a margin of hours, was a division of paratroopers who had spent 2 years learning to fight surrounded, because being surrounded is the natural condition of a man dropped behind enemy lines. To an airborne soldier, an encirclement was not a catastrophe. It was Tuesday. The German plan assumed the defender would think like a conventional infantryman, count the odds, see the ring closing, and behave rationally. The Americans holding Bastogne did not do the arithmetic that way. So the race to the Meuse came down to a question of timetables measured in hours, and the men who answered that question were riding into it on cattle trucks, cold and short of everything. Von Manteuffel needed the roads clear by the 18th. On the 19th, they were not clear, and every hour after that the ring around the town held would cost the 5th Panzer Army something it could not buy back: time. A truck convoy moving at night without lights is a controlled accident waiting to happen, and the road from Reims to Bastogne on the 18th of December was one long braid of them. The trucks were open 10-ton semi-trailers borrowed from the Red Ball Express, built to haul cargo, not men, and the men rode standing because there was no room to sit. Diesel exhaust and cold wind, fingers locked around the wooden side rails. A soldier who dozed off risked pitching over the side into the dark, so they leaned on each other in ranks and stayed upright the way cattle do, which is exactly what the vehicles had been requisitioned to move. Colonel Julian Ewell rode near the front of the 501st Parachute Infantry, and he had almost nothing to work with. The division had come out of Holland gutted, short on riflemen, short on machine guns, and critically short on the one thing a defense eats fastest, which is artillery ammunition. Men drew bandoliers from open crates as the trucks idled, counting rounds by feel in the dark. Some had no overcoats because the winter clothing was still catching up from the rear depots. Others wore whatever they had scavenged. The quartermaster failure was real, and the soldiers paid for it in frostbite before the Germans fired a shot. The German timetable never accounted for what came next. While the paratroopers were still on the road, Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division was already dying in front of the town to buy them the hours they needed. Colonel William Roberts split his command into 3 small teams and threw them east and northeast onto the very roads Manteuffel needed, at Noville, at Longvilly, at Warden. Team de Sobry, a company of Shermans and a company of armored infantry under a 26-year-old major named William de Sobry, dug in at Noville on high ground, 4 miles north of Bastogne, and met the full weight of the 2nd Panzer Division coming west. What happened at Noville on the 19th and 20th of December is a small masterpiece of buying time with lives. Dessabry's tankers fought in fog so thick they could not see the panzers until the ranges closed to a few hundred yards, and then the fog would lift for 10 minutes and expose everyone at once, tank against tank at knife range. The Americans knocked out German armor they could not properly see, took losses they could not replace, and held a road junction that the 2nd Panzer had expected to roll through in an afternoon. Dessabry himself was badly wounded and captured. His stand cost the Germans most of a day, and in that week a day was worth more than ground. That day bought something concrete. Every hour Team Dessabry held Noville and Team Cherry held Longvilly was an hour the paratroopers used to file off the trucks and walk into position around the perimeter. The two forces never planned it as a relay, but that is what it became. Armor absorbing the first blow forward of the town, while infantry set the ring behind them. General von Manteuffel, watching his lead column stall against roadblocks he had been told would not exist, later admitted the resistance around Bastogne was far stronger and organized far faster than his intelligence had promised. His own word for the situation was that the town had become a thorn, an Angelpunkt, a hinge his whole advance turned on and could not pull free of. The Germans made a decision here that looked correct and was fatal. Rather than pour the whole 47th Panzer Corps into reducing the town, they chose to mask it, to leave a screening force around Bastogne and send the armored spearheads flowing past on either side toward the Meuse. It was doctrinally sound. You bypass strong points and let follow-on infantry mop them up. But it meant the crossroads stayed in American hands, and a crossroads in American hands is a crossroads full of American artillery observers, calling fire onto every German column that used the parallel roads. The mask did not smother the town. It just gave the garrison a clear field of view. By the night of the 20th of December, the ring was closed. Something like 11,000 American troops sat inside a perimeter roughly 16 miles around, cut off from resupply, low on shells, some of them still without proper coats. From the German side, it looked like a textbook encirclement, the kind that had swallowed whole armies in Russia. Kessler and his fellow gunners were already laying in the batteries the ultimatum would boast about. The trap the Germans thought they had set had a defender inside it who did not read the situation as a trap. That misreading, more than any single battle, is what the next week would expose, 1 hour at a time, one road at a time in the snow. A field artillery fire mission on the 21st of December began with a number scrawled on a ration card, because that is what the gunners of the 463rd Parachute Field Artillery had been reduced to, a written cap on how many rounds each battery could throw per day, per target, per emergency, and per stretch of perimeter that came under threat. The howitzers were 105 mm and 75 mm pieces, and by the 21st, the shell count behind them had fallen to something the fire direction officers tracked by hand, gun by gun, because a mistake meant a battery went silent at the exact moment a company on the perimeter screamed for support. The men who served those guns had never fought a battle shaped like this one. There was no front and no rear. A battery laid to fire north at dawn might be swung to fire southeast by noon and due west by dark, and the crews learned to displace the trails and relay the tubes across the whole compass, because the panzers came at the ring from every road at once, and the guns had to answer in every direction the roads pointed. Colonel John Cooper commanded the division artillery, and his problem was arithmetic of the cruelest kind. He had enough tubes to be dangerous, and not nearly enough shells to be generous, so he did the thing that separates a professional gunner from an amateur. He refused to fire at anything that did not matter, and hoarded the rounds for the targets that did. The order that came down was blunt, and the veterans remembered the phrasing for the rest of their lives. No gun would fire on a target of fewer than a set threshold of Germans, and every observer was to hold his fire until the enemy massed into something worth a shell. What Cooper actually told his fire direction centers was that they would shoot only when they could kill in bulk, and that a battery caught wasting ammunition on a lone half-track would answer for it. It was rationing dressed as doctrine, and it worked because the alternative was running dry on the 23rd and dying on the 24th. The gunners counted rounds the way a man counts matches in a snowstorm. Look at the map of that perimeter, and it stops looking like a siege line and starts looking like a wheel. Team O'Hara held the southeast toward Worden. The 501st faced the woods to the northeast. The glider infantry and the 502nd manned the north and northwest around Longchamps and Champs, and everywhere the line ran through frozen foxholes hacked out of ground so hard the entrenching tools rang off it like anvils. The cold was its own enemy, and it did not care whose side a man fought on. Temperatures fell well below freezing, boots froze to feet, and trench foot took men out of the line as efficiently as shell fragments. The German infantry probing those roads suffered exactly the same frostbite in exactly the same snow, and the symmetry is worth sitting with, because nothing about this battle was one-sided in misery. What differed was the fire waiting for them when they massed. The panzers probed, and here the German competence shows plainly. These were not amateurs throwing armor at a wall. The 26th Volksgrenadier and elements of the Panzer Lehr and the 2nd Panzer pushed against the ring methodically, testing each road, looking for the seam where the American shell supply thinned or a gap opened between two undermanned companies. They found seams and exploited them, and every time they concentrated enough tanks and infantry to punch through, they concentrated enough to trip Cooper's threshold, and the rationed guns opened all at once on a target finally worth the rounds. An observer would watch a German assault company crest a rise, wait until the manual said he could shoot, and then bring the massed fire of multiple batteries onto men who had bunched up in the open snow. The rationing did not weaken the artillery. It sharpened it into something that only spoke when it could do real damage. By nightfall on the 21st, the ring was complete, and every road into Bastogne belonged to the Germans, except the ones the American guns could reach, which was all of them. The garrison inside was cut off, low on shells, low on medical supplies, after a field hospital had been overrun and captured on the 19th, and fighting in a full circle on frozen ground. From von Luttwitz's command post, the situation looked finished. An 11,000-man pocket ripe for the ultimatum his staff was already drafting. From inside the pocket, it looked like a lot of work and not much sleep. The gunners relayed their tubes in the dark, checked the count one more time, and waited for the Germans to give them a target big enough to be worth a shell. 2 words, 4 letters, and a German staff that could not decode either of them. The reply came back to von Lüttwitz's command post, typed on a single sheet, and the officers who read it, men fluent enough in English to run interrogations, stared at a message that made no grammatical sense as a response to a surrender demand. The ultimatum had been a serious document. It warned of annihilation by massed German artillery. It gave a 2-hour deadline, and it was signed by a corps commander who believed the 11,000-man pocket had no rational choice left. What came back was nuts. 1 word. No verb, no threat, no counteroffer, no acknowledgement of the terms at all. Here is where the language barrier turned into a small comedy of intelligence work. The German parlementaires who had carried the demand asked for clarification, and Colonel Joseph Harper, who escorted them, translated the sense of it plainly. It meant, go to hell. The Germans understood that, but the word on the page was the problem. Their translators reached for the literal meaning, a small hard-shelled seed, and found nothing that mapped onto a military reply. An interrogation officer's whole training is built on reading an enemy's intent through his words, and this enemy had answered a formal ultimatum with a snack. That confusion is documented, and it matters more than the joke suggests. The Germans had constructed the surrender demand as a rational instrument, an offer built on the assumption that the defender would perform the same arithmetic they had. Encirclement, no supply, no relief in sight, overwhelming artillery on call. The sum was surrender. The reply told them the defender was not doing that math at all, and a professional staff finds nothing more unsettling than an opponent who declines to behave logically. You cannot predict a man who will not count the odds the way the manual counts them. The Soviets had faced their own version of this at Stalingrad 2 years earlier, and the comparison is worth a moment because it cuts the other way. There the Germans were the encircled army, and Paulus's Sixth Army did the arithmetic exactly as doctrine demanded, held on past all hope, then surrendered 90,000 men when the sum finally came due, because Hitler had forbidden the breakout that logic required. A rational defender inside a closing ring eventually capitulates, and the German command knew that pattern intimately, having been on the receiving end of it, which is precisely why McAuliffe's answer landed so strangely. The word did not fit any file they had. Back to Bastogne, because what followed the refusal was not a bluff, and both sides knew it. The German artillery the ultimatum had bragged about was real, and on the night after the answer, the guns opened, joined over the following days by the Luftwaffe, which came over Bastogne. In strength, the Germans could still muster this late in the war. The town itself burned in places. Bombs fell on the aid stations, on the cellars where civilians and wounded sheltered together, and a Belgian nurse named Renée Lemaire, who had been tending the wounded in a converted garage, was killed when the building took a direct hit on Christmas Eve. The men she cared for survived to name her, and the doctor who ran that station carried her name out of the pocket. Watch what the shelling actually accomplished, though, because it is the whole irony of the ultimatum. The German bombardment fell on a garrison that had just told them no, and it did not move the perimeter. Meanwhile, the American guns, still rationing every round, still holding fire until the enemy massed, kept doing the one thing that made the crossroads unbearable to the Germans, answering their attacks with concentrated fire the instant they bunched up on the roads. The threat in the ultimatum promised annihilation by artillery. What the week actually demonstrated was that the side inside the ring had the more efficient guns, shell for shell, because it refused to waste a single one. The Germans had wanted a yes. They had built the entire theatrical apparatus of a formal surrender demand, the white flag, the blindfolds, the 2-hour clock, around the expectation of a rational capitulation, and the machinery jammed on a word their linguists could not process. Von Lüttwitz, who had already called the town a hinge his advance could not pull free of, now had documentary proof that the hinge would not turn. The pocket had answered his best instrument of persuasion with one syllable and then absorbed his bombardment without folding. So the deadline passed. The guns spoke on both sides, and the crossroads stayed exactly where it had been. The Germans went back to what they had been doing since the 19th, probing the ring, road by road, waiting for a seam. The garrison went back to counting shells. Visibility unlimited. Those were the words the weather officer logged on the morning of the 23rd of December, and for a garrison that had spent a week under a lid of gray Ardennes cloud, they might as well have been scripture. The high pressure the meteorologists had promised finally rolled in from the east. The overcast tore open, and the sky over Bastogne went a hard, brilliant blue for the first time since the trucks had unloaded. Cold came with it, the dry, crackling cold of a clear winter high, so sharp that men's breath froze in their eyebrows and the snow squeaked underfoot like styrofoam. But nobody inside the ring was cursing the temperature that morning. They were looking up. Because clear skies meant airplanes, and airplanes meant everything the pocket had been rationing. The C-47s came in low over the perimeter around noon, formation after formation of them, engines beating against the cold air, while the parapets tumbled out under red and yellow and blue parachutes that drifted down onto the drop zone west of town. Men who had been counting artillery rounds by hand ran into open fields under the canopies, dragging bundles through the snow, while German fire reached for the transports overhead. The pathfinders had jumped in that morning to mark the zone, and the pilots flew straight and level through flak that knocked some of them out of the sky because a wavering approach scattered the load. In 2 days, the resupply flights put hundreds of tons into the perimeter. Artillery shells first, then rations, then the medical supplies the surgeons had been out of since the 19th. The starving line was still hungry, but its guns were no longer empty. The sky did the other half of the work. The same clear weather that filled the drop zone unleashed the fighter bombers, the P-47 Thunderbolts that had sat useless on their fields all week, and now they came over the German roads with bombs and napalm, and 8 50-caliber guns apiece. The masking columns von Lüttwitz had sent, flowing past the town, were suddenly naked under a blue sky, strung out on roads with nowhere to hide, and the jabos worked them like a threshing floor. From inside Bastogne, the men could watch the smoke rise off the German supply routes and know, for the first time in a week, that the misery was flowing outward now. The weather had cost the Germans dearly, and they knew it. If the ring could not be squeezed shut before American air power and Patton's relief column arrived, it had to be broken open now, in one blow, and General Kokot of the 26th Volksgrenadier planned the Christmas assault as a surgeon plans an amputation. He picked the northwest, the seam near Champs and Hemrula, held by the glider infantry, the weakest-looking arc of the wheel. He massed his best remaining armor, 18 tanks painted white for the snow, and loaded them with grenadiers, and he threw them in before dawn on Christmas morning, while it was still dark and cold enough to freeze a wounded man to the ground where he fell. For a few hours, it worked the way the map said it should. The white tanks punched clean through the outpost line and drove toward Hemrul, and the German infantry poured behind them into the gap. Then, Cooper's rationed guns found the target they had been saving a week's worth of shells for. What happened next was the whole battle compressed into 90 minutes. The tanks that broke through split into two groups, and both drove straight into the American artillery, firing over open sights, into bazooka teams and tank destroyers, and the massed 105mm fire the fire direction centers had been hoarding for exactly this. The grenadiers riding the hulls were cut off from the armor and killed in the snow. Every white tank that crossed the line was knocked out, burned in the fields around Champs and Hemrul, some of them within sight of each other. Cocot's amputation severed nothing. His best assault force drove into the strongest fire the pocket could throw and simply ceased to exist as a formation. General Heinz Cocot wrote about that morning after the war, and his verdict on it was flat and professional. The attack had been carried out with the utmost determination, and it had failed completely. His word for the outcome in the report was that the assault collapsed. It had not withdrawn or stalled. It had collapsed. By Christmas afternoon, the perimeter sat exactly where it had sat on the 20th. The same 16 miles of frozen foxholes, except now the guns behind it were full, and the sky above it belonged to America. The Germans had spent their last serious attack, and the Crossroads was still American ground. A single tank company covered the last 4 miles into Bastogne in the fading light of the 26th of December, and the man who led it was a lieutenant named Charles Boggis in a Sherman he had named Cobra King. He came up the road from Assinois with his gun already hot, firing into the tree lines as he rolled. Because the corridor the 4th Armored had torn open was a knife cut, not a highway. A single thread of road with Germans on both shoulders who had not been told they were beaten. The engagements record that Boggis fired better than 20 rounds on that final stretch, mostly into bunkers and hedgerows he could not clearly see, hosing the flanks to keep the thread open behind him. At a few minutes before 5 in the afternoon, he rolled up on a cluster of engineers from the 101st clearing mines near the perimeter wire, and the first man to reach his tank was a lieutenant named Dwayne Webster. The corridor was open. It was 300 yards wide and under fire, and it was open. Patton had promised this. On the 19th, at the Verdun Conference, he had told Eisenhower he could turn his Third Army 90 degrees out of its eastward attack and drive north with 3 divisions, and the room had not believed him. Rotating an army through a right angle in winter, on ice, across a road net already choked, was the kind of thing staffs war-gamed for weeks. He did it in days. The 4th Armored, worn thin from months of fighting and down to a fraction of its tank strength, led the drive up from the south and spent 4 days grinding through Chaumont and Bougainville and Assinois against exactly the kind of resistance that should have stopped it. Feel the weight of what that drive cost, because the relief was not a parade. The 4th Armored bled for every village. German anti-tank guns sat hull down behind stone farm walls. The ground was frozen glass that threw tracks and slid Shermans into ditches, and the same cold that killed men in the Bastogne foxholes killed men in the relief column's open turrets. Colonel Creighton Abrams, who commanded the combat command that made the final push, looked at the last stretch to Assenois and decided the careful, methodical approach would take too long and cost more. So he ordered the direct charge up the road, the gamble that put Bogus through the wire before dark. Abrams would command tanks again in another war 2 decades later, and his name would end up on the tank the U.S. Army still fields. But on the 26th of December, he was a lieutenant colonel betting a tank company on one run at a defended road. Now set the 2 clocks side by side, the German one and the American one. Von Manteuffel had needed Bastogne clear by the 18th. He got a relief corridor punched into it on the 26th, 8 days past his deadline, with the town still American, and now reinforced. Every one of those 8 days was time the 5th Panzer Army spent on a road junction it never took, instead of on the Meuse it was supposed to reach, and the Germans said so themselves, in their own words, after the war. Von Manteuffel, writing for the American historians who debriefed the beaten commanders, was blunt about it. The failure to take Bastogne early had thrown the entire timetable of the offensive into disorder and tied down forces the drive west could not spare. Cocotte described the town as a thorn that his divisions could neither pull out nor ignore. These are not American boasts, but the words of the men who ran the attack, explaining in flat professional prose why it failed. And the answer they keep returning to is a crossroads full of paratroopers who would not do the arithmetic and quit. There is a small detail from that evening that goes nowhere and that I find hard to leave out. Cobra King. The tank Bogus drove through the wire, survived the war, was misplaced for decades in the U.S. Army's inventory, and was eventually identified and restored and put on display. It changes nothing about the battle. It is simply the actual machine that closed the last 4 miles, still bolted together, still wearing its name. The starving G held a Belgian Crossroads for a full week because holding it was the whole point, and the men who tried to take it away spent the rest of their lives explaining, on the record, why they could not. The perimeter that closed on the 21st opened on the 26th in exactly one place, 300 yards wide, and never closed again. Bogus climbed down off Cobra King and shook the engineer's hand, and the Germans went back to counting the days they had lost. Von Manteuffel signed the report that admitted it, and the sentence he chose is the one that matters. Writing for the American historians who debriefed him after the war, the commander of the 5th Panzer Army put the failure of Bastogne at the center of the whole collapse, not on the flanks of it. The offensive had a schedule measured in hours, and the schedule ran through 7 roads that met in one Belgian town. When those roads stayed shut, the timetable came apart, and everything downstream of the timetable came apart with it. The fuel that had to be captured before it ran out, the Meuse bridges that had to be seized before the Allies woke up, the whole gambler's sequence that depended on speed and got a siege instead. The town cost them dearly in the ledger of the campaign. 2 panzer divisions and the better part of a Volksgrenadier division spent the decisive week wrestling a road junction instead of racing for the river. And the tip of the German spearhead, the 2nd Panzer, ran dry within sight of the Meuse near Celle, with its tanks out of fuel and its flank open. The 5th Panzer Army had aimed for Antwerp. It got as far as a village called Foy Notre Dame and a fuel gauge on empty, and then the American armor it had bypassed came down on it from the north. The parallel that keeps pulling at me is the one the Germans themselves had lived through. At Stalingrad, the 6th Army had been the encircled force doing the arithmetic. Here, they were the attacker, and they broke their offensive against a pocket that refused to do the arithmetic at all. In both cases, a single fixed point on the map absorbed a massive movement and would not let it go. The difference is who was inside the ring, and this time it was the Americans, and this time the ring held from the inside out. The enemy's own paperwork is the most honest witness we have, so read it. Cocotte called Bastogne a thorn his divisions could neither extract nor ignore, and for von Lüttwitz, the town was a hinge his advance could not pull free of. Von Manteuffel, in flat professional prose written for the men who had beaten him, said the delay there disordered the entire operation. Not one of these is an American boast. They are the debrief notes of professional soldiers explaining without excuse why the largest German attack in the West since 1940 ground to a stop, and the noun they keep circling back to is a crossroads. The part I admire most has to be said plainly. The men who held the perimeter did not know they were killing the offensive while they did it. They knew they were cold, that the shell count was written on a ration card, that the aid station had run out of plasma and then run out of the nurse who worked it. The strategic result, a wrecked German timetable, a spearhead stranded on empty, a last gamble spent, was invisible from a foxhole outside Champs on Christmas morning. They were not holding the crossroads to doom Hitler's plan. They were holding it because the order was to hold it, and because giving it up was not a thing they were prepared to do, and the doom of the plan was the byproduct of that stubbornness, tallied up later by the losers. And the losers were not fools. Cocotte's grenadiers walked into massed artillery fire with the utmost determination, his own words, and died in the snow because determination does not stop a 105 millimeter shell. The panzer crews who painted their tanks white for the Christmas attack were professionals executing a sound plan against the weakest arc they could find. The plan was not stupid. It simply met a defender who had more efficient guns, a clearing sky full of American airplanes, and a relief column that turned an army through 90 degrees in the time the staff manuals allotted for planning it. By the last days of December, the maps told the story without commentary. The bulge that had lunged toward the Meuse stopped, then began to be pushed back, and the road junction that was supposed to fall on the 18th was still American, and now thick with Third Army armor. The offensive that was meant to reach Antwerp reached a fuel gauge, a stalled spearhead, and a debrief room where its commanders would spend their post-war years writing down the name of the town that broke the clock. At his headquarters after New Year's, von Manteuffel began drafting the withdrawal, the orders pulling his divisions back east across the ground they had bought in blood and could no longer hold. And somewhere down the line, an American forward observer near Bastogne picked up his handset, called a fire mission onto the retreating columns, and read off the coordinates.